So, quick question for you. Have you got any Tupperware at home?
I don't know. Probably some knocking around somewhere.
You've not seen it lately?
No.
Been to any Tupperware parties?
No.
I don't even know if they're still a thing. The reason I'm asking today, Tupperware went into administration. Well, it didn't. It went into bankruptcy protection.
Oh, okay.
American Chapter 11, for people who know about that. Which is one step short. Creditor protection during restructuring and all that in America. But anyway, they're suffering.
Suffering indeed.
Been overtaken by cheap Chinese imports. Well, they say cheap imports, but you seem to just put the word Chinese in.
Yeah, that's kind of the...
do. Maybe you can import from other countries too.
Oh, there we go.
But also I think the war on plastic. General trend. Remember when Phil Caudle came in?
Yes, yeah.
Episode 22, talked about his plastic-based business doing packaging products. And he'd moved into cardboard, hadn't he? But maybe either too late or the acquisition didn't work well for him. But Tupperware seems to have resolutely stuck to plastic.
A disaster in this modern age. Disaster. So what are we supposed to store our food in now? Well, no more leftovers.
Maybe there'll be more food waste.
You got to eat it.
I think you have to buy one of the cheap Chinese imports. And use that. Or surely everybody uses takeaway food containers, don't they?
Takeaway.
They're just not big enough.
Not big enough. No. Oh, what a shame. The end of the Tupperware party.
What I thought was interesting, though, from the point of view of what can we learn as small business owners, is that if you've got a product whose market moves away from you, all the strategies they deployed of offshoring manufacturing, rebranding, going digital, building a community with recipes on their website and all that, it's kind of for the birds, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
If someone doesn't want nobody wants your product, you can dress it up whichever way you want.
Yeah. I feel the rejection. I can empathise with Tupperware.
It's tough.
They
just need to say, no, game's up, lads, let's wind this one up and go and do something else, because you don't do that, do you, when you've got 75 years of history behind you.
What a shame. I wonder if they'll come back. Do you reckon they'll be reborn? Someone will?
Yeah, I think the way Chapter 11 works is it just gives you protection from the creditors while you restructure. So you get to effectively do what we would do as a Phoenix thing over here.
Maybe there'll be a resurgence. Maybe it will, become something of... Now it's in the public eye.
Yeah, true. Like vinyl records.
People will be saying, actually, you know what we should have?
Yeah, retro.
The old-fashioned Tupperware party. I've never been to one. I don't know.
No, I think it was the sort of thing that maybe our parents might have heard about. Maybe they even went to them. I don't know. It was
the Avon lady.
70s thing. Yeah, with Avon ladies. And the guy who comes around for the pool's money.
Pool's
door to door to get the pool's money, yeah. That's how it started, didn't it? Anyway, we're showing our age now. Should we do a podcast? Bring us up to date. Hello and welcome to the SME Growth Podcast from Wellmeadow, and every week where we try and come up with something interesting or useful for owners and managers of small and medium-sized enterprises. And we just gave a bit of an update there in the intro on a business that seems to be failing at the moment, quite a few salutary lessons. And I guess what will have been discussed in their board meetings are all sorts of very serious options, but hopefully their directors were taking their responsibilities seriously in navigating that firm through its rather difficult period. And that's what we're talking about today, really, the roles of directors and the role of a board of directors as a distinct thing. Yeah. And we thought this was useful, even though it's a bit of a dry subject for many. A lot of new directors coming into their role for the first time get a bit worried about this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Might be useful to talk about it.
Yeah, a bit of a framework.
So quick summary of where we've been the last 3 episodes. Last week was a bit risky.
What was it?
Episode 86 about risks. Do SME managers
take risks?
Take enough risks? Do they balance the risks? It was the poker playing guy that triggered that one off.
Yep.
Episode 85, labour reforms. Still to be announced. No doubt we'll come back to that one.
Yep. Update coming shortly.
Yeah. In the news again today, though, about the civil service not now enforcing the 3 days per week in the office. Work where you want, really.
Just checking as well, you bought your own clothes, right?
I bought my own clothes.
You paid for them.
There was a scandal recently, wasn't there? I have paid for all my own clothes. I don't have a sponsor. If anybody listening wants to be the SME Growth Podcast,
we want to get on this.
Sponsor.
We want on this gravy train. So if anybody wants to sponsor the clothes on this,
I think we need to make sure we have a different outfit for every episode.
I think maybe we should stipulate, though, if we could just have the cash to buy the clothes. Otherwise, I think we're going to get dressed in some horrendous stuff.
Get dressed up in fancy dress.
So yeah, but no, we buy our own clothes here.
We buy our own clothes. Unlike some leaders of the Labour Party and spouses. And we will come back to the subject of labour reforms when that comes up. And 84, still very popular for those into that sort of thing, RevOps.
RevOps, revenue operations.
Yeah.
How to go from lead to cash and make sure you've got all of your various siloed operations unsiloed, joined together, making money.
Making money, yes, indeed. So that was RevOps. So that was the last 3 episodes. So that brings us to episode 87.
87. Well, who'd have thought?
Who'd have thought?
The giddy heights of...
Back in, whenever it was, November 22 was our first one. So here we are, episode 87. So like I say, I thought we'd talk about this today. It cropped up at one of the clients we work at the other day. I just thought it'd be worth a reminder of what are the responsibilities of a board. We're having a bit of a refresh of how the board meetings work and what they're focused on. And it's, I suppose, not too surprising, but people don't spend every day going on the Companies House Act, the Companies Act and reading it all, or going on the Institute of Directors website. But directors should at least be vaguely familiar with
whether they
what they've signed up
have
for.
some duties.
You have a legal duty. In theory, you could be sent to prison.
No, I had to go through this as well with someone the other day who wasn't quite sure what their role was on the board or how it functions. And so, it's just quite I think it's a useful framework, but it's also the laws.
It is also the law, yeah.
Worth knowing.
Certainly the director's responsibilities. But I thought we'd start with the role of the board.
Yeah.
Because actually, when you boil it down, I think that what a lot of smaller and medium-sized companies tend to get blurred in their mind is the difference between a board in a big company sense, what is just the board for, and what does it tend to get used for in small and medium-sized companies, because it's the time when you're all meeting anyway, and most directors have some sort of executive role as well. In bigger companies, the number of execs on the board is the minority, and you've got a lot more non-executive people representing all the various interests of the various shareholders, and they're delegating to management. So a traditional classic board would have 4 main roles. And I can rattle those off, and we can talk about each of them if you like.
Yeah, go for it.
Set the vision and mission and values, all that sort of stuff. And we've talked about whole episodes on that before, so we'll come back to that. Set the strategy and structure to deliver that vision and mission and values. Delegate stuff to management, maybe not at tactical level, but delegate the responsibility of delivering that strategy to the managers. And then exercise some sort of accountability to external stakeholders, which will certainly include the shareholders, but also be responsible to the bank, if there's other funders, debt funders, your accountants, your broader public, and so on. So they're really the 4 things you have to do as a board. So if that's all you had to do, you could turn up to a board meeting saying,
easy.
Is vision changed? No. Strategy okay? Yeah. Managers know what they're doing? Yeah. Shareholders okay? Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Done.
That's it. That'd be
great, it's not so simple, is it? I think even start with the first one, establishing the vision and the mission and the values. That's often, are we pushing this into the SME land now rather than big corporate?
Well, exactly, because that's where it all gets a bit different.
Because I think big corporate PLC, probably the vision, mission, values is a lot more established because it's partly CSR, corporate social responsibility. It's partly just, if you've got a lot of people, you've got to align them behind something.
You probably have a subcommittee from the main board, including probably the chairperson.
A lot of
MD setting all this
there's
stuff
a lot of chatter and talk around about younger generations looking for more purpose-led organisations, that type of thing.
True.
So for larger companies, that becomes a much greater consideration. But I think maybe for a lot of SMEs, this whole thing, vision bit, is seen as the fluff that doesn't get talked about. I
think we mentioned that in that episode on it, doesn't it? It needs to be taken much more seriously. Look at Tupperware, we talked about them this morning, or in the past, big ones around Kodak or Sony or whatever.
As I even read this morning in my little devotional that I was doing, without a vision, the people perish. And I've quoted
by you,
proverb of mine. But it is true. You've got to have that vision to...
you got to know where you're going. What's the point of setting off on a journey if you don't have some sort of direction, even if not an absolute destination?
Yeah.
And as we've said before, especially in that episode on visions, there's a lot of people that feel that this is a committee-led organisation. Yeah. And I think in the large organisations it probably has to be. But in our experience of trying to run vision sessions in smaller firms, where you haven't got a load of experts in strategy or people steeped in the knowledge of their marketplace in all sorts of more esoteric ways, this is a lot harder to do by committee.
Yeah.
And even though this is a role of the board the real role of the board is to make sure that it's been done. Could be to do it itself, or it could be to accept that the owner, perhaps, or the leader of the organisation has put a lot of thought into this, and it's their vision, and that the board agrees that that is in the best interests of all stakeholders. So it's a tricky one to try and just happen and say, Thursday afternoon, let's come up with a vision.
Yeah.
It's a bit like that sort of, go and be spontaneous. It's
exactly.
hard to do.
And I think as well, when we could talk about this all podcast, so we probably should move on, but just to make a point on the values bit as well, particularly the board need to exemplify the values.
True.
And if you want, case in point, all this news at the moment, not wanting to, beat on poor old Kia, but that's a case in point there where you've got at the most senior level, somebody is acting in a way that is potentially hypocritical or could be viewed as hypocritical.
Yeah.
And it causes all sorts of stuff to happen. Disillusionment undermines things. So again, just translating that into SME kind of land. That if you're on the board, your duties in a way go beyond just what your legal duties are. It's about that authentic leadership piece. Yeah, which is maybe a subject for another podcast.
You got to walk the talk, but you're right. Maybe that's the whole thing. Actually, values and the types of values that people decide to articulate, and then whether they follow through in actual behaviour.
Exactly.
So once you've got a vision, whether that's been given to you or developed as a board, you've then got to work out how to implement it, and that's where strategy and structure come into play. Yeah,
and so structure.
Sorry, did you pick up a slight sneeze?
There we go. It's very dusty in the podcast studio today.
My microphone cover must have some dust.
Exactly. We have got a huge construction project going on across the road.
Yes,
and so maybe
here at the moment it's been quite noisy the last couple of days. We've got a demolition project.
Demolition crew. So, but So if vision is where you're going, strategy is how you're going to get there, and structure is kind of a key part of that. Really, who do you need?
Yeah, what's in place?
What's in place to make that happen?
Remember the old rocket model of how vision, strategy, culture and structure all sort of fitted together. So I suppose strategy, absolutely, that's what a board would consider itself to do. And often they have strategy sessions, confusing that a bit with vision. But ultimately, a strategy is just a coherent and connected set of decisions that we either choose to take or not to take with the aim of getting to the vision. The structure is how you deliver that. Have we got the right number of people with the right skills in the right places. With the right responsibilities? Yeah. And that's something we've dealt with in a few boards recently, is a complete revamp of roles and responsibilities and making it absolutely clear what's going on. In fact, a client we both know very well that changed ownership, was it just last year? One of the first things they did was to clarify roles and responsibilities and made a big difference. Yeah. So good luck to them. So yes, that's something that the board has to be constantly aware of. Because there's no point just beating up management, especially even if you've got the twin hats of being both manager and a director, saying you haven't done this job properly. If there aren't enough people with the right skills who've been asked to do the job properly, that's just a waste of time.
I think there's that, I'm looking at the book now, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rumalt.
Yeah, Rumalt.
Is it Rumalt? I think that's right. Where he talks about strategy as being the three parts of it, which is the diagnosis of, what's the real honest appraisal of what's going on here and where we are, and, brutally honest on that, and then have some guiding policies, which are kind of how we're gonna, how do we act, and these will be largely influenced by your values as well, I imagine, and then a coherent plan of how you're actually going to deliver it, which leads on to the next bit of this of delegating to management. The board has got to set the plan up so that it can actually be delegated.
Yeah, and in a big board, the only executive on the board might be the MD. Yeah, people in small and medium-sized companies find that odd because they're all directors who have department head responsibilities. But it could well be that you've got a chairman, a number of independent directors, possibly with someone called the SID, the senior independent director, maybe someone from shareholders externally is on, and then the MD. Whereas in our world, that's not the case. You have the MD, often the chair of the board, and then the rest of the people around the table all have a department to run. So they're sort of delegating this to themselves. And I think that's the tricky bit. When you're in a board meeting in a smaller company, you've got to be aware of these two hats you're wearing. Yeah. You're there as a director in that meeting, but you can't escape the fact that you are also the one answering to yourself, if you like, as to why haven't we got enough sales in, or why is efficiency down, or why are our recruitment not up to whatever. So you've got to be able to be aware, I suppose, when you're answering a question, which part of you is answering the question. Am I now the director challenging you or ourselves on it, or am I now the executive answering it?
I suppose the flip side of that is that you've got more almost real-time information, isn't it? If you're on both sides of the fence,
Yeah.
if you're on the board and you're also doing the job, then you have almost got that real-time day-to-day what's going on. Whereas if you were just sitting on the board getting a monthly report, that's quite a different kind of mindset.
Absolutely, because you only know what you're getting told. Whereas when you're doing it all day long, you've got much closer information. So we'll come to that in a minute, I think, actually, because that's quite interesting how that varies when executives are directors as well. But the fourth role of the board then, for those of you taking notes out there and trying to memorise these, is to exercise accountability.
Yeah.
And that's to external stakeholders, including shareholders, obviously, but anybody else providing funding, your lawyers, your accountants, maybe your trade bodies, that ambassadorial role. So that's part of what the fourth role. So just to summarise again, the four main roles as defined by the Institute of Directors in the UK: establish the vision, mission and values, set up the strategy and structure to deliver it, delegate to management, and then exercise accountability to external stakeholders. So that's ultimately where you start out. But it doesn't always work that way, as we've been discussing throughout in smaller firms. And I think what you picked up on there was one of the major ones, in that you've got much more information at your fingertips when you've got executive directors on the board.
Yeah.
So the discussion doesn't tend to get stuck at the esoteric or principles.
Yeah.
You can actually dive down into detail.
Yeah.
But if you're not careful, you then dive right down into the weeds, because people can.
Yeah.
And then you're no longer in a board meeting. You're in some sort of, I've had meetings which you could have thought of, this is a health and safety meeting. We've spent so long talking about the nuances of who's doing the risk assessments and whether we've had the PAT tests done, or maybe into a sales meeting, because perhaps the issue of the month is lack of sales. And before you know it, we're reviewing the whole pipeline and asking whether you've spoken to the decision maker yet and all that stuff. So it gets a bit detailed, but that is its strength as well. So it's trying to get that balance, isn't it?
Yes, so they tend to be. So do we want to talk about maybe contextualising this a little bit more in the SME world? So having had those four major kind of call them, overarching, the main roles, guiding principles of the board, an SME board will probably be more operationally focused, because of...
That's the point I was making there, I think, really.
The fact that...
depending on the subject of the day, you can suddenly become an operations meeting if you're not careful. Yeah. But that is part of the benefit of it as well.
Yeah. And is there anything you've seen where you could, how do you help people distinguish those two things? Is there...
Yeah, well, I guess because we are always chairing the meetings that we're in, that's our role, right? We allow a certain amount of that discussion to go on, because it helps to colour in the picture, and there may well be something in there that we're looking out for to say, right, is this a board decision we now need to take? Is it going to affect our strategy or our structure or the delegated instructions we're giving to management and so on? Is it going to do that? Or are we now just running a meeting that you should be holding elsewhere? So I think that's where I see my role, and I know you do the same in yours, where you stop the conversation after a point and say, look, that's been really interesting. Can we make a decision in here about that, which is definitely a board level decision, or shall we now take that offline, as the old phrase goes, discuss that somewhere else and report back next month. Yeah. So I think that's where we have that check and balance. But it does mean, and to the other point, we can make decisions faster. Yeah. We can have all the facts to hand, and when you come to that point, say, right, can we make a decision then as a board? Quite often you will. Rather than having to say, oh, well, we'll have to defer to such and such, we'll have to ask for a report or delegate it to a subcommittee and all that sort of stuff. So no, let's just do it now.
And we often have a section, we always have a section in our board meetings when we're taking the minutes that talks about decisions made since the last board meeting as well. Because I think in an SME land where you can get all the directors might even be working in the same office. So if they can make decisions that, I'm not talking about just ordering a new, coffee machine or something, but strategic decisions can be taken and then ratified in the board meeting.
Well, that came about several years ago now, when we were trying to trawl back through some board minutes to work out how a particular strategic decision had been taken, which hadn't gone very well. Well, that's being kind. It had gone awfully. And so we introduced this decisions made since last meeting for that purpose, to ratify them, but also to make directors aware that they're running this company as directors day in, day out. That you don't have to wait for a board meeting to be a director. You're doing it all the time, and some of the decisions you're taking are requiring almost a resolution. Certainly, if you're going to do some really serious board level stuff, changing the fundamental funding structure or whatever. But we always say, is there anything that's changed the funding of the business, senior level appointments? Have you taken on any risky contracts? Changed the supply base substantially? anything appeared on the risk register that's
flagged up.
So that's about the decision making. You can do that a lot faster.
Yeah.
And it's kind of allied with this other point we've made here in our notes about problem solving, that you've got all the right people in the room.
Yeah.
And the amount of times we say in a board meeting, there's no one else responsible for anything going right or wrong around here other than the people in this room.
Yeah.
All the bucks stop in here.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't need to have to go outside of here and ask for any more. This is it. Come on, let's get our heads together and make a decision and solve this problem between us.
I think if you can, should a board meeting be somewhere where you do that problem solving? Probably not, I would say, unless it's an absolute crisis that's happened, and in which case it's probably a slightly different context of meeting. But like you say, that should almost be the place where you say, well, having made all these, we've done the problem solving bit, we've identified, say, a new market or a new product or whatever, and now we're coming into the board meeting to ratify that, make sure we've got us all squared away in terms of responsibilities, have we covered all the angles, and kind of formalise that decision making. But you don't want to really probably turn your board meetings into a how do we solve this problem?
A workshop
meeting. Yeah.
And I think you're right. You don't want them to be the place you wait to solve your problems. And in fact, in the standard board report format that we've got on our website that we always recommend people to have, we ask them to have a bit of a summary of what's happened, more of a detailed view of what's about to happen, and then thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, what do we need to discuss or decide upon today? And that's where, if you've done your homework beforehand, whilst you may still do a bit of problem solving around it, in that your solution may be fine-tuned or knocked into shape. It's not as if you're starting from scratch. Needs a bit of prep.
Yeah, and we've had some quite positive feedback. I think we did a whole podcast episode on it, which I can't remember now, 60 something or other, somewhere in the 60s. There's one on board reports, which you can listen to, should you so desire.
Oh, that went down quite well.
And that went down quite well. But good feedback from that. How people changed their the way they're approaching board meetings and board reporting. So rather than having huge amounts of putting days into writing a board report, just really make it short, snappy.
Yeah, it's a good test for people, really. If you're spending more than half an hour putting your board report together, then ask yourself, why aren't I just keeping a few notes by the side of my keyboard through the month ready for it, rather than doing it all the time? And if I can get it to a 1 page, ideal. Don't give me a 30-page boring piece.
And with a lot of the sort of sales and marketing stuff, we're seeing some interesting change of behaviour maybe with HubSpot, because all the data is in one place, single source of truth. Using HubSpot dashboards then to drive the board reporting.
Yeah, don't even take a snapshot from the screen and put it into a PowerPoint. No. Just use the browser version, because then if somebody says, but what's that bar made of, or where's that, you just click on it and it tells you. So it's interactive.
But also as well, because that information is there all the time, back to the whole kind of we don't need to problem solve in the meeting. It can be interrogated outside of the meeting.
And people become familiar with it, single source of the truth, it's always up to date. There's lots of benefits. The last point, I think, that where smaller boards vary is a dangerous one if you're not careful, but it's where the view of the governance role is less formal. And I think that's okay to some degree. We don't have to have remuneration committees and audit committees and all the sort of stuff that a PLC might have. But there is still a role for it. And I'm frequently asked in the boards that I chair, can you just cut back on the formalities? Even though they only take, say, 5 minutes of a 2, 3 hour, 4 hour meeting, people don't like the fact that they're not getting into it. But I say, look, this is here to protect you as well. The articles say you have to have called this meeting with due notice having been given to all the directors. Well, can we just note that? And the Companies Act says you have to declare any conflicts of interest, which will come in a minute. Can I just put down that nobody's declared any conflict? It's just so in the future you've got a nice little historical record of the fact that you've known your responsibilities and you've complied by them. It doesn't have to take a long time.
No.
So anyway, that's a bit of a summary then of the role of the board as distinct from the roles of a director. Now, I think, if we were to turn the page now and talk about that a little bit, I suspect there's quite a few people that if they found this episode by searching on YouTube or on Google or whatever, this is the bit they were after. I'm just about to become a director. What are the roles of a director? What do I have to do differently? As opposed to the roles of the board. So we've done that bit first because as a director, you're a member of the board and you need to know both. But the director bit, I know that often when people become a director for the first time, they get given some training, often by in-house counsel or some the team lawyer that the company uses. And it tends to be horrifying, really frightening stuff. You're going to go to jail if you don't do this, and you've got to make sure that. On a practical level, I don't think day to day people are being dragged off to the cells because they haven't taken the minutes properly.
Yeah.
You've got to be pretty seriously negligent in your running of a company before you're in any bother.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that as directors we shouldn't all be interested in, well, what actually are we here to do legally?
Yeah.
We have a legal responsibility as defined in the Companies Act.
I think a lot of people will want to, a lot of people who are probably becoming directors, you'd hope, are there because they were good at what they did, they cared about their job, they cared about the company, that type of thing. So it's sort of the natural extension of that to say, okay, well, I've got some other, if I'm wearing this director's hat now, what do I need to know? How do I need to...
And the other thing, just being brutally honest about it, an awful lot of small and medium-sized companies have directors who are directors to help the tax-efficient distribution of dividends because it means you don't have to employ someone with an employment contract. And those people aren't that involved in the day-to-day of the business. And spouses of founders and other directors is a common one.
Yeah.
And I see this a lot where they have no idea at all what they've signed up for. And this may well be a useful summary for them as well. I mean, and none of this should really take you by surprise, right? Looking down the list, if you've read the Companies Act, if you don't agree with any of these, then perhaps you shouldn't have taken on the role in the first place. There's a couple of things, maybe nuances. But the first one that's mentioned in the Companies Act is just to act in the best interests of the company.
Yeah.
You are there. A company is a legal entity, right?
Yeah.
And it needs humans to bring it to life, and that's what the directors do. They're the human representation of the company. So you've got to act in its best interest. It's like being a guardian of a child.
Yeah. And it is for a lot of SMEs, for the owners, it probably is a child, isn't it? In a sense.
Yeah. But it does stress that you've got to act in the long-term interests of the company. And you do get some directors who maybe get a little bit too short-termist about, don't spend any money at all. Well, you're allowed to invest in stuff.
Yeah.
But you've also got to take into account all stakeholders, which includes employees and suppliers and customers. You've got to take a balanced view in both time and breadth. So that's important. The nuance about that one is where you've got group company structures, and you may well be the director of the holding company and one or more of the subsidiaries. And it's important to remember that your duty to act in the best interests of the company applies separately to each of the companies you're director of. So even if the group company says, let's close down one of the subsidiaries, you may well agree with that as you're sat in the board meeting of the group company. You've then got to go and have a board meeting in the subsidiary and ask, what's my decision here? Am I able to comply
from
with
this
that?
perspective?
Yeah, and in the balance of things.
Yeah. So another one then is to promote the success of the company.
Yeah, so this is more than a passive, don't
a LinkedIn
talk it down.
post.
LinkedIn post, it's pretty lightweight, isn't it? But at least you're promoting it, assuming you're saying the right stuff.
Exactly, yeah.
But saying nothing isn't really promoting the success. That's just not saying bad things.
Yeah.
Okay. So promote the success of the company however you may do it.
Yeah, and that extends back to all things, doesn't it? How it's not necessarily, I think you can hear that and think, well, this is about marketing and selling. It's this promoting the success is around how you do your operations, how you treat staff, how you all those things.
Exactly.
Exercising independent judgment. This is
now this one is really, really difficult for me to get across, and I've seen this especially with younger board members and especially with non-financial directors. Finance directors know what they're doing here. Other people tend to defer to either another expert on the board or the groupthink, and the second one is the really big danger, especially with younger directors or less experienced directors. You are there because they want the diversity of people on the board to each have their own view.
Yeah.
And you've got to be prepared to stand up and express your view, even if you're the only one that holds that view in a sea of opponents. And it's hard. Right? But that's the point. You've been given the legal, not responsibility, but duty to have independent judgment. And especially around the financial side, you're not allowed to say, oh, I'm not very financial. That's what I'm relying on the FD. How do you think all these frauds have happened over the years?
Yeah.
It's because FDs have run amok, unchallenged by others. Now, it does say that you're expected as a finance director to have more responsibility for the finances, because clearly that's your profession. But it doesn't absolve the non-finance directors so that they need to know nothing.
Yeah.
And it's happening every board meeting I go in. I ask all the directors, has anybody got any question on the accounts? I get met usually with a sea of either blank faces or nods. and then you point out something that really they should have all asked for, and there's a bit of a shuffling of papers. Come on, you've got to be reading this stuff. If you don't understand it, ask questions. So it's one of my sort of bugbears, really, that you've got to exercise independent judgment. If you've got 5 or 10 people on the board, you want 5 or 10 different brains thinking differently, even if they agree.
And I think that's part of that might then be board culture. So you've got to have that kind of psychological safety that people can say things.
Yeah.
I mean, we've actually been brought in to help particular boards in the past where there was a dominant personality and no one else wanted to say anything. So there's a place for someone to sort of facilitate that and maybe encourage, particularly people who may be just on the board or maybe a bit less experienced, that to say, what do you think about this, and almost invite the opinion, because sometimes there's different personalities. You'll get your extroverts around the table that are quite happy to talk about their opinion, and oftentimes more introverted people, or for whatever reason, they just don't, maybe it's a tricky, complicated, nuanced subject and they don't know how to articulate it. You've got to try and make sure that everybody is given the opportunity to say things. And I think a lot of this is around, you've got to put your integrity first when it comes to independent judgment and say, right, can I sleep tonight if I don't say something, or if I don't think something's right, can I say, I've got to speak up, or you've got to speak up. So I think that's
I think it's harder when you're if you're an employee director, and there's a very strong founder there, and you fear upsetting the founder may have a consequence to your future, either lack of progression or even losing your job, then you're conflicted. And that's where I think you've got to have a long, deep, hard look about whether you can fulfill the role or not. But I do accept that it is a challenge. But going with that, you've got to exercise reasonable care, skill and diligence in your decision making. Sort of goes without saying. In fact, nearly everything else on here I think wouldn't surprise people. They're kind of common sense.
There's a slight nuance on this one, isn't there, for around finances, isn't it? So that anyone who's got a finance role is expected to have an additional level of qualification or responsibility, and that's not to dissolve responsibility for those non-financial people.
It's about what's reasonable, isn't it, that old legal phrase. But even as a non-financially trained person, it would be reasonable to expect as a director, you've gone on maybe a finance for non-financial managers course, you should at least know how to read a P&L on a balance sheet and maybe understand the concept of cash flow, if not generate a cash flow statement. You're not supposed to be able to produce these documents, but they're made by others for your benefit.
And we found just on that point, the financial side. So we came up with a graphical P&L years and years ago, didn't we, to try and visualize the accounts, which is very helpful to people on the board who aren't financially. I think a lot of FDs know where all the numbers are. They know where,
and they like reading tables of numbers because they're familiar with them.
Whereas if you're not, then good old graph can help.
Now, the next three I want to lump together, partly in the interest of time, but partly because they're all very allied. They're all Companies Act responsibilities of a director, and they're all sort of obvious. But you've got to avoid conflicts of interest. We talked about that earlier in terms of the formalities of a meeting, stating the fact that nobody has declared a conflict of interest. So that could be having shares in a company that's a supplier or a customer, or one of those companies has a very close relative working for them. These are all very clear conflicts of interests if you have investment positions or relations. Not accepting benefits from third parties, it should go without saying that you don't select the supplier that has just, bought you, a lifetime supply of wine or put a new garden shed in or whatever.
Clothes, glasses, that type of thing.
Yeah, and if there are any proposed transactions, then you also have to, it's a separate duty. Not just what has already happened, but what might in the future happen. So there's three allied ones there. Don't do stupid stuff. Don't be conflicted in your number one, which is acting in the interests of the company. Don't let that be distracted by personal gain elsewhere. And then the other ones, I think, are once again just a bit more sort of obvious from a professional's point of view. Obey the law, apply with all legal obligations for the company, whether that be notification of accidents under RIDDOR or submitting your accounts on time, and all these sort of basic things. Manage your financials prudently. You don't be risky. You're not running a betting operation here. You've got other people's futures at stake. You have to be reasonable. And take a leadership position on governance and risk, which is partly what this is all about. You've got to understand your roles and responsibilities to be able to do that properly. And don't ask the chairman to say, don't worry about the risk register this month, we haven't got time. Well, what happens if that's the one thing you should be talking about?
Exactly.
So there you go. Tour de force of roles of a board and a director.
Hopefully everyone wasn't too bored by that.
See. How are you spelling that?
Classic dad joke. Dad joke in there. Got to get it in. Keep the practice up.
Wouldn't be the same without it, would it? Well, thanks, Rich. It's all good. Interested if anybody's got any questions on that. There's quite a bit of stuff on our website on this as well, isn't there? So we've put some links on there and some explainers. So
good board meeting guides on there as well.
And there's a good board meeting guide. Yeah, exactly.
Download that.
Talks about all of that. So hopefully directors old and new and boards old and new will have got something out of that.
Refreshed and revigorated.
Exactly. So thank you once again for making it through to the end of another SME Growth Podcast. That's episode number 87 on boards and directors. Hope you found that useful. If you did, then please pass it on to others. Either send them a link or tell them about it in the pub. And in the meantime, good luck with your business.